Chapter 25 of Mr. Wicker's Window. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Ferguson. Mr. Wicker's Window by Carley, Dawson. Chapter 25. As soon as the night was dark enough, Chris loudly complained of not feeling well, of being hot and dizzy, and in no time Captain Blizzard had, as loudly, told him he was to go to bed on a cot in the captain's cabin. Captain Blizzard closed the door behind him, and in Amos's and Ned Cilley's hearing told Mr. Finney that he was much afraid that Chris had a touch of sun and was coming down with a tropical fever. Chris remained alone in the cabin from that time. Soon, in the cool of the night, the sailors of the Mirabelle set out in dinghies to a cascade of fresh water that emptied itself into a cove at its farthest end, taking with them casks and barrels to replenish the ship's water supply. Their deep voices swept back over the water to where Chris stood by the open port of the captain's cabin. He was forcing himself toward the moment when he must board the Vulture. His resolve was held back by his mounting anxiety as to how best to carry out what would be necessary, and a strong natural reluctance to leave the Mirabelle. Leave it he must. He stood pondering on what shape to assume, and when he heard the cry of a belated night-bird, and saw it coast by on silent wings to vanish in the night, he decided to take that shape. It took all his courage and determination, but this was the first step toward what he had trained for so long to do, and he knew he must do it, and at once. The boy looked a last time around the cabin, then spoke the magic formula in his mind, and with a sudden enjoyment in the sense of flight, he soared away from the ship out over the cove. The bird swept twice around the Mirabelle, rising higher as it went. Below, the few lights of the ship had been carefully hooded away from the sea, and the bird, spiralling lightly on air currents, drifted out from land. The black bulk of the Vulture was easy to find in the clearness of the night. She was riding at anchor close inshore farther down the coast, and final boatfuls of men were returning from the merchantman carrying the last of the spoils. Sweeping by toward the beach, Chris saw that most of the bandit crew were already drunk, shouting and carousing round fires where they roasted wild creatures they had earlier killed. He noticed that a few Tahitians stood apart at the joining of the palm forests and the sand, watching the coarse faces of the drunken men. The Tahitians, fitting so well into the beauty of their island, gold of skin and crowned with flowers, carrying themselves with dignity, were as far removed as could be imagined from the idea of pagan men. They contrasted sharply at that moment with those from civilization, who in filthy rags of clothes and wild disorders of gestures and voices staggered about aimlessly gorging food and drinking. The watching pagans glanced from the brawling pirates back a short distance down the beach, where already a few bodies had been washed ashore from the fight. Their distaste and bewilderment were plain. Chris soared high above the din and the smoke of the fires, and then seeing Osterbridge Horsey being rowed back to the Vulture, followed after. Osterbridge Horsey had two baskets at his feet. One was filled with carefully chosen fruits, and the other with the exotic flowers of the island. Hastily changing himself into a green parakeet, Chris alighted on the rail of the Vulture, just as Osterbridge Horsey reached the top of the ladder. Determined to make a good impression and perhaps catch Osterbridge's fancy, Chris, in his bright parakeet plumage, bobbed his head and sidled up and down the ship's rail, eyeing Osterbridge Horsey with his head on one side, as he had seen parakeets do. The manoeuvre succeeded, for Osterbridge, with a little cry of pleasure, declared himself enchanted. "I must have that little bird!" he exclaimed, and carefully taking off his fashionable hat, even more out of place in the tropics than it had been on the Georgetown docks, he slapped it quickly over the parakeet, which allowed itself to be captured. This Osterbridge Horsey's own prize made him crow with delight. Clambering as gracefully as possible over the battle-scarred side of the Vulture, he took the parakeet gently out from under his tricorn. "A parakeet! As I live!" he shrilled, sounding very like a parakeet himself. My soul, what a prize!" he rattled on, entirely to himself as it turned out, for the sailors were not at all interested in a pet. Exhausted from the battle, or drunk from captured wine, and all despising the fastidious ways of Osterbridge Hawsey, they paid not the slightest attention. They obeyed occasional orders from him, for they knew they would be whipped by Claggett Chew if they did not, and so hauled up the baskets of fruits and flowers, dumped them unceremoniously in the captain's cabin, and left as quickly as they could to rejoin their shipmates on shore. Holding the parakeet firmly, Osterbridge Hawsey tied a long silk cord to its right leg, fastening the other end to the arm of his chair, so that he could closely observe his new pet. Chris did not disappoint him. As the parakeet he played the clown for all he was worth. He strutted up and down and bobbed his head whenever Osterbridge Hawsey spoke, so that it appeared that the brightly feathered bird was in constant agreement with his captor. Or he would cock his head to one side, as if weighing one of Osterbridge's remarks in a truly comical manner. Looking about meanwhile with his black beady eyes, Chris saw that Claggett Chew was lying in a bunk against one wall, nursing his left leg, which had been given a sword thrust in the fight. He was obviously in pain and perhaps feverish, and Osterbridge Hawsey's childish talk irritated and bored him, so that he turned his face to the wall. Light from the swinging lamp that Chris remembered from many weeks before threw black hollows into Claggett Chew's eye sockets and deeply lined face. Now and again he could be heard grinding his teeth at the pain of his wound, but Osterbridge Hawsey, throwing his fine coat and plumed hat to one side, light-heartedly amused himself by trying to tempt his new pet with some fruit. "Claggett," he cried, as if Claggett Chew could possibly be interested in a parakeet at that point, "do look at what I captured. This is my very own spoils of war," he crowed. Claggett Chew made an impolite noise and said nothing. "Well," Osterbridge Hawsey gave a shrug, as answer to the noise, "you know how I detest fighting. It is vulgar, messy, and noisy. I can imagine no possible good word to say for it, and I see no reason why you could not have made them give up their cargo without a skirmish. Ugh!" he said at the remembrance. "Now a good gentlemanly fight with a rapier is quite another thing," he went on. He smirked and made a face at the parakeet, who did its best to smirk back. "That is a graceful and fine art, refined, and not at all degrading to one's character." No sound from Claggett Chew. Osterbridge Hawsey rattled on, and Chris, pecking at the fruit proffered him, thought that sometimes Osterbridge Hawsey might quite possibly talk just as gaily to himself as he did to the unresponsive Claggett Chew. "Claggett, your men!" His voice rose. "Really, they are making an exhibition of themselves on the beach. Just as well there is no one to see them but some aborigines. Quite revolting. How can you bear to associate with such types, when you are so much above them yourself? But there, I must not pique you, must I, poor Claggett? I expect your wound smarts a trifle." Claggett Chew turned his face toward Osterbridge Hawsey, his eyes blazing with rage and his mouth working with the fretful annoyance of an ill man, but he only muttered and turned away again. "Do you know," his more delicate friend pursued, stretching out a long finger for the parakeet to perch on, which, to his evident pleasure, it instantly did, "do you know, Claggett, this dear little creature seems fearless and almost human. Quite touching." He paused, admiring the vivid colours of the feathers, which perhaps awoke a kindred feeling in Osterbridge Hawsey, loving a fine display as he did. "I shall give you a name, my little feathered captive," he said, and pondered. "I wonder what would be suitable. Something French, undoubtedly." He waved a hand, and the lace at his wrist fell forward in a not overly clean frill. "Louis, after the dear king. No, that would be too great an honour for so small a bird, gaudy though you are. I think Monsieur, after the king's brother. That's it, little Monsieur." He broke off dreamily. "To think that I once knew such a royal, such a distinguished man," he sighed reminiscently. For the first time words came from Claggett Chew. He bit them off as if the saying of them cost him very great effort. "More extinguished than distinguished, I would say." Osterbridge Hawsey permitted a sad, condescending smile to cross his face, and he shook his finger at Claggett Chew. "Ah, Claggett, you never knew him, you see. I am sure you would have liked him. Such charm, so distingué. "Oh, dear me, yes, a most unusual royal personage," Osterbridge Hawsey said, smiling happily at his parakeet. "Most of them are so much alike." He singled out several fresh fruits, peeling some for Claggett Chew. Silence fell over the cabin, except for Osterbridge Hawsey's delicately smacking lips as he finished the fruit and licked his fingers one by one, the increasingly heavy breathing of Claggett Chew, who fell asleep, and the distant sound of shouts and clamour from the shore. Osterbridge Hawsey made a pouting face at the sleeping figure of Chew. Evidently Osterbridge was bored. He went to the door and clapped his hands, but no one responded. Except for the two men and the parakeet, the Vulture was deserted. Osterbridge Hawsey came back into the cabin, holding a bottle of wine which he uncorked and poured into a glass. Chris, foreseeing what would follow, hopped up to the back of his new master's chair, where he hoped he would be forgotten, and tucked his head under his wing in case Osterbridge should look at him. Waiting for the right moment was the hardest thing Chris had to do, but he knew, as Osterbridge Hawsey drank glass after glass, and his book fell from his fingers, that the right moment would not be long in coming. End of chapter 25. Recording by Linda Ferguson.